So, okay. So I'm going to just start this. This argument, unlike some of the other arguments for God, this argument has been around only since the Middle Ages, when St. Anselm got it up. Some of the other arguments, like the argument from first cause, Aristotle had a version of that going. Basically, the ontological argument is in a different category from things like the design argument and what is called the cosmological argument. Now, this thing is so slow in responding. We're not going to worry about Aquinas versions of the cosmological argument, the argument that God is necessary as the first cause of the cosmos. That's the one that relates to the Big Bang theory. Just because we can't do everything, I thought, since there's been a lot of discussion recently over intelligent design and whether it ought to be taught in the school system, and you all in your regular life might run into that at your child's school or might be confronted with that issue, I thought I'd focus on the design argument. But we're not going to do that till after test one. But these arguments are a posteriori. That means you can see the word post for after. An a posteriori argument is based on experience. So the word is after experience. In other words, it gets underway from citing some facts about the world. And the design argument says that things have purposeful ends. The last one relates to the design argument. You know, the pens or pencils you're writing with fulfill a function or purpose. So does your cell phone. So do those glasses on the desk and the cup that is holding the coffee. But we say if things fulfill a function, they didn't just get that way by accident. They were designed to fulfill that function. So if things in nature seem to fulfill a function, were they designed to do so? And who would the designer of nature be other than God? So those arguments rest on experience, and we'll look at the design argument after test 2, after Wednesday. But Anselm's argument claims that we can prove God's existence with the necessity of a mathematical proof. The other arguments are probabilistic. They say if our argument works, it's more probable than not that God is around, either as the first cause or the designer of the universe. Whereas this argument says, hey, look, just from the abstract concept of God, a priori means prior to and independent of any experience, of anything having to do with the world, we can prove our argument. So the logical argument says that all we have to do is look at the abstract concept of who God is supposed to be, and from that concept, it's going to follow with the certainty of a proof in geometry that God has to exist. Now you may or may not agree with this argument, but we're going to try to understand it. And it's not an easy argument to understand. I used to call it an expressway or a shower argument. I say, what do you mean by that? Well, it's one of those things where you can sit in class today and even Friday and sit there and listen to it and say, boy, I don't follow this at all. That than which none greater can be thought has to exist in reality, or else it wouldn't qualify as that. What does that mean? And so you're either stuck in traffic on the expressway, or you're lathering up in the morning taking a shower, and all of a sudden it just hits you. Oh yeah, that than which none greater can be has to exist, or else it wouldn't be. You know, it's one of those arguments, and sometimes, you know, it goes by you the first time, but then it just hits you, you know. So don't worry if you don't quite get it today. That St. Anselm of Canterbury, a monk in the Middle Ages, is the first, as far as we know, to have used this argument. There are versions of it that have come down even today. Historically, Descartes is the most famous. The debate over whether this argument worked was reopened in the 20th century, in like the 1960s, really late 1950s, when Norman Malcolm and Alvin Plantinga got up technical versions that seemed to deal with all of the previous criticisms of the argument. So there's been a back and forth discussion for about 1,000 years on whether this argument works, right? And it continues. It's called the ontological argument because ontos is the Greek word for existence or being. Ontology is a branch of philosophy that deals, as Aristotle said, with being as a topic of discussion itself, with existence as a topic, with being qua being. So that's hence ontological. In other words, it gets underway from an abstract concept of the being of God, of who God is. And the concept that Anselm works with is God as the greatest being we can possibly imagine. In other words, if God is around as God is traditionally conceived in monotheism, what can be greater than God? Right? So God is a being than which none greater can be thought. Now, he says that even somebody who denies God's existence, and that's who the fool is, will still agree on this concept of God. Now, remember, Anselm's not writing in the kind of pluralistic society we're living in. Anselm is writing in the Middle Ages in a predominantly Roman Catholic country. So he's not calling people names by using the word fool, but he's quoting a biblical verse. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So the fool, in quotes, is a person who denies God's existence. And so what he's saying is, even somebody, at least in his society, who denies God's existence would still agree with him on the concept of who God is. They say, well, okay, I agree, you know, that that's what we're talking about by God. You know, the fool would say, the denier of God, but I just don't think that God's around. Right? I agree with you on the concept. I think that the concept doesn't refer to any being that exists. So can we deny God's existence? Now, a deductive argument is such that you would contradict yourself by accepting the premises and denying the conclusion. And that's what Anselm has here, and he's trying to convince us that, folks, could you put your phones away? I mean, this is getting really annoying to me. You know, I mean, I don't care if you listen to me, but I'd like you to at least, you know, pretend like you're listening to me, you know. I mean, it's just really annoying that people are just sitting here doing nothing but keying in stuff in their phones. You know, I hope whoever you're having your text discussion with is going to help you get this material down well enough that you'll do well a week from today. But somehow I suspect that they're not. Okay, so Anselm says we're going to contradict ourselves if we deny God's existence and yet agree on the concept of God. So what is somebody claiming who denies God exists? He says, well, they're basically saying that, okay, I've got the concept of God. God exists in my mind as an abstract concept in the understanding, but God does not exist in reality. God is not out there. Now, here we go into a little bit from Plato's theory of forms that we're not going to talk about a lot. But for Plato, for something to be morally better or greater is also for it to have a greater existence. And this is a sort of assumption from Plato that goes on in the background of this argument, but it's unstated. And so basically, this is Anselm's own illustration. He says, look, it's one thing for a painting just to exist as a concept in the mind of the painter. It's another thing for that painting to exist in reality after it has been painted. And so he draws this out to the discussion of God. So it's greater to exist in reality than only in the mind. So if that than which none greater can be thought existed only in the mind, then we could think of a greater being, but that is one that existed in reality as well. In other words, if the fool were right and that what fits the concept, the greatest being we can think of, had no referent, existed only in the mind, we would say, well, then we're not thinking of the greatest possible being, because the greatest possible being, since there is nothing greater, must exist in reality in order to qualify as the greatest possible being. So he's saying, if that's the case, if we can think of no greater, then that than which none greater can be thought has to exist in reality, or else we would contradict ourselves in claiming that the greatest possible being we can think of. So God must exist not only in the mind, but in reality as well, or we could think of a greater being, but we can't think of any being greater than that than which none greater can be thought. So now I think Descartes' version of this argument is a little easier to understand. But at any rate, that's how it moves. And again, you have to kind of look at it. But he says the fool has to admit that what is in his or her mind also exists in reality. Now, we'll look at Guanillo's objection next time. But it's one thing to believe or not believe in God, as God is traditionally conceived. It's another thing to agree or disagree that an argument that somebody claims proves God's existence really does the job. Now, Guanillo was a fellow monk presumably as devout a believer in God as St. Anselm, but he has the leading historical objection to Anselm's version of this argument. And so even though they both believed in God, Guanillo did not think that Anselm's proof of God worked. So we'll look next time at why he didn't think that. So, okay, again, we'll do more on the ontological argument Friday. I mean, you're basically dismissed. I don't want to make anybody late. And review on Monday.